This is an introduction to aerial shadows. This is to go along with the supplemental file that's available. If you do not have access to the file, just let me know and I will get it to you. So let's get started here by looking at a simple box shape. Uh, 2-point perspective, shouldn't be anything new at this point. What we're going to do is start to work out the shadow from here, but before that I'm going to identify the outline for the elevated plane. Since we're not working on a shadow from an object that's on the ground plane, it's a little bit different, but for the most part very similar. And so the first difference we see is when we do the shadow vanishing points. With a box on the ground, we wouldn't worry about this point because that part of the shadow would be covered up by the rest. It would be basically under most of the box itself. But in this case, we need it to understand where the shadow is going to be when it hits the ground. And we see that in the next step when the light source comes in. So our shadow vanishing point, this is the uncommon point. We're cutting through there to figure out where that shadow's direction is going to be. The light source tells us where that shadow is going to fall on the ground. And so this is the only difference from an object sitting on the ground plane. What we're going to do with this then is connect these 4 points. So where the light source and the shadow vanishing point intersect, that gives us our shadow outline. So pretty straightforward at this point once you have cast shadows down, but you have to kind of include that extra step. Now it gets more complicated if we have a three-dimensional object in elevated, but still it's just a matter of breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces. So we'll go ahead and darken these objects in. So there's your elevated plane, there's your cast shadow on the ground. Alone, they won't make any sense, so I'm leaving you the guidelines in just to see. But if we recap to the file, so let me zoom out here. So this is the first step. This was your box and elevated plane. Here's your shadow guidelines, which we've already gone over. Light source, the object in the case, and in this image, this is where we want to jump back to it. I've lightened the other lines so you can really get a sense of where that cast shadow is going to be without some of the clutter that the guidelines start to create. Another important reason to be using different values and different line thickness to organize this information, because especially if we added two cast shadows from this one object, you can see where those guidelines almost start to increase exponentially, and then there's our final again with the lighter lines. So we get a little bit of a sense. When we consider this first step in a more practical application, it takes us to an image like this, and I bring this up only briefly just to kind of point out the importance of seeing all those different guidelines. If we go to early in this process, this is the basic shape. So this is that what we would expect if we were just dealing with a box. We get a sense of where that shadow is going to fall. We're breaking it into pieces. In this case, we're just looking at the legs. We don't have a third line here because this shadow is going to extend off, so we don't need to know that endpoint. From there, we're going to just keep developing that aerial portion. So starting to get a sense of where it is. This third line, that back part where we normally wouldn't worry about. In this case, we don't need the foreground because it's going to extend off the composition. It just becomes irrelevant to include. Going down, basically our connecting lines. We can talk about this in more detail if you get to it, but it's about that process of keeping things organized because as you can see, this is just an elevated plane with a couple legs, and our guideline numbers are increasing just tremendously, and so that organization becomes important. But by the time we get to step 10, we're at that same point we look at the aerial shadow, that we're just doing a cast shadow from that plane, and just to establish that top, and then we can go back in, connect the easier parts of the legs, and that's where we start to get our cast shadow with the table. And you can see here a real long cast shadow off the composition, but we still have plenty of information that shows that we know how to use shadow vanishing point and light source together to create cast shadows. One final thing to keep in mind, consider your placement. In this case, there was enough other information that we really didn't need to see the entire shadow. You can really get a strong sense of how the elements are coming together. In an image like this, placement, we're Do you want these shadows to overlap? If they meet up here, if they met at this edge, rather than having this intersection back here, would it still make sense? Would it be something that made sense in a composition? And so the height of your light source matters, where you place that shadow vanishing point to see where these intersections are, and that's where simple sketches, a little bit of trial and error at times, especially as you develop an understanding of how that light source and shadow vanishing point are going to work with your objects, are all important to having that kind of cohesive image at the end where everything makes sense. There's not a lot of confusing areas, and your viewer can understand what those intentions were that got you started.